The air in the VIP section of the Apex lounge was heavy enough to crush a diamond. It smelled of aged bourbon, expensive cologne, and ruthless ambition. Located on the top floor of a towering glass skyscraper in Manhattan, the Apex wasn't just a private club. It was the battlefield where the city's elite quietly tore each other to pieces. Chloe Adams stood in the shadows near the heavily soundproofed doors, wiping a bead of condensation from the chilled silver tray she was holding. She adjusted the stiff collar of her black server's uniform, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't belong here. She was a 22-year-old law student drowning in student debt, spending her nights poring over constitutional law textbooks, not serving thousands of dollars worth of liquor to corporate predators. But desperate times demanded desperate measures. Just 3 hours ago, her older sister Mia had called her from the emergency room sobbing hysterically. Chloe's 5-year-old niece Lily needed an immediate specialized surgery. The hospital required an $80,000 deposit up front. Chloe had taken this emergency double shift, hoping the tips from the high rollers might somehow make a dent in the impossible mountain of money they needed by dawn. Table 4 needs a refill on the Macallan. Her manager, an excessively nervous man named David, whispered harshly as he pushed her toward the floor. "And listen to me, Adams. Do not make eye contact. Do not speak unless spoken to. That is Alexander Thorne sitting there. If you breathe too loudly, he could buy this building just to fire you." Chloe knotted her throat tight. She reached up and subtly tapped the tiny Bluetooth earpiece hidden beneath the thick waves of her dark hair. She had kept the line open with Mia at the hospital, muting her own microphone, so she could listen and offer comfort whenever she stepped away from the tables. "Chloe, the doctors are coming back." Mia's terrified voice cracked in her ear. "If we don't have the transfer confirmation soon, they'll have to delay the procedure. I'm so scared. I can't lose her." A sharp pang of grief hit Chloe's chest. She took a deep, steadying breath and pushed through the velvet ropes into the main VIP area. The lighting was impossibly dim, casting long, sharp shadows across the room. Table 4 was secluded in the far corner, a semicircular leather booth that looked out over the glittering skyline of New York City. Sitting in the center was Alexander Thorne. Even a law student buried in textbooks knew who he was. The media called him a visionary. Wall Street called him the executioner. He was the CEO of Thorne Enterprises, a man who possessed a lethal combination of breathtaking looks and absolute terrifying power. He sat relaxed against the leather, wearing a bespoke midnight blue suit that clung perfectly to his broad shoulders. His dark hair was impeccably styled, but it was his eyes that froze people in their tracks, a piercing, icy blue that seemed to dissect everything they looked at. He wasn't alone. Sitting across from him was Marcus Langdon, a rival CEO who looked visibly sweaty despite the excessive air conditioning. The tension radiating from their table was toxic. Two massive men in dark suits, Alexander's security team, stood like stone statues a few feet away. Chloe approached silently, stepping softly on the plush carpet. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached out to collect the empty crystal tumblers. "You think you can force me out of the Silicon Valley acquisition, Alexander?" Marcus sneered, his voice tight with barely suppressed rage. "I have the board on my side. You're overplaying your hand." Alexander didn't raise his voice. He didn't even blink. He simply slowly rotated the glass of bourbon in his hand, watching the amber liquid catch the low light. "The board is loyal to money, Marcus, and by tomorrow morning your stock will be in a free fall. You're already bleeding out. You just haven't realized you're a dead man yet." His voice was a low, smooth rumble, devoid of any emotion. It was the voice of a man completely devoid of mercy. In Chloe's ear, the sound of a medical monitor began to beep rapidly. Mia let out a muffled sob. "Her heart rate is spiking, Chloe. I don't know what to do. They're telling me to step outside." Panic seized Chloe's chest. For a split second, she forgot where she was. She forgot the ruthless billionaires, the threats, and the golden rule of the Apex Lounge. Acting entirely on instinct, she reached up and tapped her earpiece, unmuting her microphone to reassure her terrified sister. At that precise moment, Marcus slammed his fist on the table in a surge of frustration. The loud thud caused Chloe to flinch, her elbow knocking against a heavy crystal ashtray. To catch it, she leaned forward quickly. Looking down at the dark mahogany table right next to Alexander Thorne's hand, she whispered urgently into her microphone. "It's okay, baby. Just breathe. I'm taking care of it. I'm right here." The silence that crashed down on table 4 was absolute and terrifying. The low hum of the jazz music in the background seemed to fade into nothingness. Marcus Langdon's jaw went slack, his eyes darting from the waitress to the terrifying CEO. The 2 security guards immediately stiffened their hands, drifting instinctively toward the insides of their suit jackets. Chloe froze. The blood drained from her face as she realized her catastrophic mistake. She wasn't looking at her hidden microphone. Her face was hovering mere inches from Alexander Thorne's hand, and to everyone else in the room it looked exactly as if she had just leaned down and spoken directly to the most dangerous man in New York City. Slowly, agonizingly, Alexander turned his head. His icy blue eyes locked onto her face. He completely ignored Marcus. He ignored the multi-billion-dollar corporate war they were just fighting. His gaze swept over her pale face, her wide, terrified eyes, and her trembling lips. He didn't yell. He didn't motion for his guards to drag her away. Instead, a slow, dark, predatory smirk ghosted across his lips. It was a look of dangerous, unexpected amusement. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them until she could feel the heat radiating from his chest and smell the intoxicating scent of cedar and mint. "Excuse me," Alexander asked, his voice dropping to a dangerously soft octave. Chloe stopped breathing. She frantically tapped her earpiece to mute it, her cheeks burning with a fiery, humiliating heat. Sir, I'm so sorry," she stammered, taking a clumsy step back. "It was a mistake. I didn't mean to—" Alexander raised a single hand, silencing her instantly. He stood up. He was incredibly tall, towering over her at over 6'2", his imposing frame blocking out the rest of the room. He stepped into her personal space, effectively trapping her between the edge of the leather booth and his solid body. He leaned down his lips, brushing dangerously close to the shell of her ear. The room held its breath. "Don't apologize," Alexander whispered, his voice loud enough for Marcus and the guards to hear clearly. "Say it again, but slower." Chloe's breath hitched in her throat. Her mind raced wildly, desperately searching for an escape route, but she was entirely trapped by the sheer magnitude of Alexander Thorne's presence. To her left, Elias Alexander's notoriously stone-faced head of security was watching her with narrowed, intensely suspicious eyes. To her right, the exit was blocked by the heavy mahogany table. Sir, please," Chloe stammered, her voice shaking despite her desperate attempt to sound professional. "It is a complete misunderstanding. I was on the phone with—" "On the phone?" Alexander pulled back slightly, his piercing blue eyes scanning her flushed face. He saw the genuine terror in her hazel eyes, but beneath that, he saw a flicker of something else. Defiance. She wasn't dissolving into tears. She was calculating her survival. He found that unexpectedly fascinating. Alexander turned his attention back to Marcus Langdon, who was still staring at the scene in absolute disbelief. "Marcus, get out," Alexander commanded, his voice returning to that chilling, emotionless void. "The acquisition discussion is over. If I see your shell companies making a move on the Silicon Valley assets again, I won't just crash your stock. I will dismantle your legacy piece by piece." Marcus opened his mouth, his face turning a mottled red, but one sharp look from Alexander shut him down completely. The rival CEO scrambled up from the leather booth, gathered his tablet, and practically fled the VIP section. Before disappearing through the velvet curtains, Marcus cast one last, profoundly confused look back at the young waitress, who had seemingly tamed the ruthless executioner of Wall Street. Once they were completely alone in the corner, Alexander sat back down. He gestured gracefully to the empty seat across from him. "Sit." "I can't," Chloe said, gripping the edge of her silver tray until her knuckles turned white. "My manager." Your manager works for the hospitality group. The hospitality group works for Thorne Enterprises. I own the building, Miss Adams. Chloe Adams, she whispered. Sit, Chloe Adams. Chloe sat. She perched on the edge of the plush leather, feeling entirely out of her depth. Alexander poured 2 fresh glasses of the expensive Macallan. He slid one across the dark wood toward her. You just saved me a considerable amount of time, Alexander said, leaning back and resting his ankle over his knee. Marcus was stalling. He thought I was getting distracted, perhaps weak. But you… He chuckled, a dark, rich sound that sent a shiver down Chloe's spine. You made him think I was so utterly relaxed, so untouchable, that I allow my mistress to serve drinks during a hostile corporate takeover. I am not your mistress, Chloe fired back, her protective instincts finally overriding her fear. And I really need to go. My niece is in the hospital. That's who I was talking to on the earpiece, not you. Alexander paused the crystal glass halfway to his lips. The baby. She's 5, Chloe said, her voice cracking as the reality of Lily's situation crashed back over her. She felt the hot sting of tears prickling her eyes. She needs emergency surgery tonight. I only took this shift to try and make enough tips to pay the hospital deposit. So if you're going to have me fired for being unprofessional, just do it quickly. I have somewhere I desperately need to be. Alexander studied her in silence. He had spent his entire life reading liars, corporate thieves, and manipulative politicians. He knew precisely what a lie looked like. He looked at her worn-out, sensible shoes, the slight fray at the hem of her uniform skirt, and the raw, unadulterated desperation in her beautiful hazel eyes. He pulled a sleek, encrypted smartphone from his inner jacket pocket and dialed a single digit. Elias, Alexander said, not breaking eye contact with Chloe. The head of security immediately stepped forward from the shadows. Yes, sir. Call Mount Sinai and New York Presbyterian. Find a pediatric patient admitted under the last name Adams. Alexander glanced at Chloe. First name. Lily. Chloe whispered, her heart stopping. Lily Adams. Find out where Lily Adams is currently admitted, Alexander instructed smoothly. Pay the entire medical bill. Whatever the deposit is, clear it. Then upgrade her to the highest-tier private VIP suite they have available. Bring the best pediatric surgeon in the state on call. Chloe gasped, her hands flying to cover her mouth. What? No, you can't. Why would you do that? Alexander ended the call and placed the phone face down on the table. Because you owe me, now, Miss Adams. And Alexander Thorne does not deal in small favors. I owe you, Chloe asked, her shock quickly morphing into incredulity. You just said I helped you with Marcus. You also publicly humiliated a man with deep pockets and a very fragile ego, Alexander pointed out. Leaning forward, the dangerous predator returning to his eyes, which means Marcus Langdon is going to wonder who you are. He's going to dig into your background. And when he finds out you are just a struggling waitress, he will realize I played him. He is a coward, Chloe. He won't come for me directly. He will come for you to get leverage on me. Chloe felt the opulent room begin to spin. So what do you want from me? I need a highly visible shield, Alexander stated calmly, as if they were discussing the weather. The board of directors thinks I am too isolated, too ruthless because I have no heirs, no wife, no personal attachments. Langdon uses that narrative to make me look unstable to our investors. I need them to believe I have a new obsession, a weakness, someone I am violently protecting. It will draw Langdon out into the open, make him reckless, and give me the justification to crush him completely. Chloe shook her head, the heavy waves of her dark hair cascading over her shoulders. You want me to pretend to be your girlfriend? Not a girlfriend, Alexander corrected, standing up and casually buttoning his bespoke suit jacket. My fiancé. You are out of your mind, Chloe said, standing up as well, fueled by a sudden burst of adrenaline. I am a law student. I have a real-life exams and a family. I am not playing house in some twisted corporate war. Your niece's surgery deposit was $80,000. It is already paid, Alexander said, coldly checking his platinum watch. And Langdon already has private investigators waiting outside the lobby of this building. If you walk out of those doors alone tonight, You won't even make it to the subway station before they grab you to interrogate you." He extended a hand toward her. His fingers were long, strong, and impeccably clean. 6 months, Chloe. You live in my penthouse. You wear the clothes I buy. You attend the charity galas I command you to. You play the convincing part of the only woman who ever tamed Alexander Thorne. In exchange, your niece gets the absolute best medical care money can buy. Your paralyzing student loans vanish completely. And when the contract ends, you walk away with $5 million in clean, untraceable cash. Chloe stared at his extended hand. It was a literal deal with the devil. But as she hesitated, her phone vibrated violently in her apron pocket. It was a text from Mia Chloe. "The hospital just told us an anonymous donor paid for everything. They are taking Lily into surgery right now. She's going to live. I don't know what you did, but thank you. Thank you." Chloe looked up from her screen, meeting Alexander's icy blue, storm-filled eyes. She realized with a chilling clarity that there was absolutely no going back. The accidental whisper of the word baby had irreversibly sealed her fate. She slowly reached out and placed her small, trembling hand into his. 6 months, she agreed, her voice barely a whisper. "But if you touch me without my explicit permission, the deal is completely off." Alexander smirked, his long fingers closing securely around hers. His grip was immediately possessive, sending a jolt of electricity straight to her core. "I do not need to force anyone, Chloe," he murmured, pulling her just a fraction of an inch closer. "By the end of these 6 months, you will be the one begging me to touch you." The ride to Alexander's penthouse was suffocatingly silent. They sat in the cavernous back of his armored SUV, separated by a leather console that felt like an impassable canyon. Chloe watched the neon lights of Manhattan blur past the deeply tinted windows, her hands tightly clutched in her lap. Just 2 hours ago, she was worrying about biochemistry grades and bad tips. Now she was sitting next to a billionaire whose wealth could rival small nations. The car descended into a heavily guarded underground garage that resembled a bank vault more than a parking structure. "Welcome home, future Mrs. Thorne," Alexander murmured as his security detail opened the heavy doors. The penthouse was a fortress, suspended in the sky. It occupied the entire top floor of the Thorne Tower. It was a masterpiece of glass-brushed steel and cold black marble. Breathtakingly beautiful, brutally expensive, and utterly devoid of any human warmth, much like the man who owned it. "Elias will have your belongings brought over from your cramped apartment tomorrow," Alexander said, tossing his keys onto a massive marble kitchen island. "My roommates," Chloe started to protest, "think you've been selected for a highly prestigious, fully funded legal internship in London. It's already been seamlessly arranged with your university. You are on an indefinite leave of absence." Chloe spun around, her eyes flashing with anger. "You hacked into my university's secured records. I endowed a new wing for their law library. It achieved the exact same result," Alexander replied smoothly. He walked to the sprawling wall of windows overlooking Central Park and loosened his tie, the very first sign of human fatigue she had witnessed. "Rules, Chloe. We must establish them immediately," he said, turning back to face her, his gaze heavy and commanding. 1. You never leave this penthouse without Elias or me. 2. You do not answer your phone unless the number is explicitly approved by my security team. 3. We sleep in the exact same bed. Chloe choked on a breath of air. "Excuse me. That was absolutely not in the agreement. I literally just said no touching. And I agreed I would not touch you without permission." Alexander corrected his long legs, eating up the distance between them as he walked slowly toward her. He moved with the terrifying, silent grace of an apex predator. "But I employ a massive staff here. Maids, private chefs, security personnel. If they see us sleeping in separate wings, the rumor mill starts. If word gets out, Langdon knows this is a sham. And if Langdon knows you are a fake, your life is in immediate danger." He stopped mere inches from her. She had to tilt her head back to look into his eyes. "So we sleep in the same bed. I have a custom king size. Stay on your designated side, and you will remain perfectly safe." His icy eyes suddenly darkened, dropping deliberately to her lips. "But cross that line," Chloe and I cannot promise I will remain a gentleman." Chloe swallowed hard, refusing to let him see how his proximity affected her. "Fine," she shot back, her voice steady. "But I sleep in pajamas. Unflattering ones. Flannel, preferably." Alexander let out a low, rough sound that might have been a laugh if he were a normal man. "We have the St. Jude Children's Foundation Gala tomorrow evening. It is the most heavily publicized charity event of the season. The board of directors will be there, Langdon will be there, and the press will be watching our every move." "I can't learn how to be a billionaire's fiancé in 24 hours, Chloe protested. "You are a law student. You know how to read a room, and you know how to bluff," Alexander replied, turning away to pour himself a glass of water. "Just look at them, the way you looked at me when you told me to say it slower." Chloe flushed the memory of her accidental audacity burning her cheeks. That was a mistake. "Was it?" Alexander challenged, glancing back over his shoulder. "Or did you enjoy the power?" Before she could formulate a defense, the penthouse elevator pinged softly. An impeccably dressed older woman with sharp features and a tape measure draped around her neck stepped out, followed by 2 assistants carrying garment bags. "Madame Dubois," Alexander greeted with a respectful nod. "Fix her." Madame Dubois circled Chloe, her critical eyes assessing every inch. Skinny, exhausted, terrible posture. But she paused, lifting Chloe's chin with a manicured finger. Excellent bone structure. "Come, child. If you are to stand beside Alexander Thorne, you must look like a queen, not a casualty." The next 12 hours were an agonizing blur of physical torture. Chloe was scrubbed, buffed, waxed, and measured. Madame Dubois was a tyrant, barking orders at her assistants. But as Chloe finally stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror the following evening, the breath was knocked out of her lungs. She didn't recognize the woman staring back. The dress was a masterpiece of deep blood-red silk that clung to her curves like a second skin before flowing into a dramatic train. It featured a daring slit up the thigh and a back completely exposed to the waist. Her dark hair was styled in glamorous old Hollywood waves cascading over one shoulder. "A vision," a deep voice murmured from the doorway. Chloe turned. Alexander was leaning against the doorframe, dressed in a custom tuxedo that fit him with devastating perfection. He looked like dark royalty, but the subtle bulge of a holster beneath his tailored jacket was a chilling reminder of the dangerous world she had just stepped into. He walked slowly toward her, his eyes dark and unreadable. He stopped right behind her, their reflections meeting in the massive mirror. "One detail is missing," he whispered, his chest brushing her bare back. He reached into his pocket and produced a velvet box. Inside rested a breathtaking diamond ring, a flawless emerald-cut stone set in platinum. He took her left hand and slid it onto her ring finger. It was heavy cold and fit perfectly. "My mother's?" Alexander stated, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "Do not lose it." "Alexander, if I mess this up tonight." Chloe started staring at the blinding rock. "You won't." He turned her around, his large hands gripping her bare waist, sending a jolt of heat straight to her core. "Just remember, you belong to me tonight. You are not Chloe, the desperate waitress. You are Chloe Thorne, the future wife of the most powerful man in this city. Let them see the fire. Shall we go to war?" Chloe took a deep breath, channeled every ounce of her courtroom-ready courage, and placed her hand on his arm. "Let's go." The gala was held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. As their sleek black Maybach pulled up to the red carpet, the flashbulbs erupted like a thunderstorm. The paparazzi screamed Alexander's name, ravenous, for a shot of the notoriously reclusive billionaire and his mystery woman. "Head up," Alexander murmured, his hand firmly resting on the small of her back. "Look bored. It drives them absolutely crazy." Chloe lifted her chin, adopting the cool, detached expression of the models she'd seen in magazines. She felt Alexander's thumb stroke her hip bone through the red silk, a grounding, possessive touch that sent electricity shooting up her spine. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of white orchids and old money. As they moved through the opulent crowd, the room seemed to part for them like the Red Sea. Men nodded with profound deference. Women whispered behind their champagne flutes, eyeing Chloe with a lethal mixture of envy and judgment. "Alexander!" a booming voice called out. Alexander's posture stiffened slightly before relaxing into a mask of casual indifference. "Senator Hayes, always a pleasure." The senator, a key figure in the state's financial legislation, shook Alexander's hand warmly before turning his gaze to Chloe. "And who is this absolute vision?" "This is Chloe, my fiancée," Alexander said, pulling her flush against his side. The senator's eyes widened in genuine shock. "Fiancé? I had no idea you were the settling down type, Alexander. I thought you were exclusively married to Thorne Enterprises." "I met Chloe, and my priorities underwent a sudden restructuring," Alexander lied effortlessly. Chloe smiled gracefully, extending her hand. "A pleasure, Senator. I've actually been closely following your recent work on the corporate tax reform bill. Clause 14 is incredibly ambitious, though I do worry about the loopholes it might create regarding offshore shell companies." The senator blinked, utterly stunned. Alexander looked down at her, a flicker of profound surprise and fierce pride lighting up his icy eyes. She knows her tax law," the senator stammered. "She is brilliant," Alexander corrected smoothly. "She is finishing her law degree." As they moved away, Alexander leaned down his lips, brushing her ear. "Clause 14 show-off." "I have a 4.0 GPA, Alexander," Chloe whispered back. "I told you I'm not just a prop. I am rapidly beginning to see that." "Well, well, isn't this a touching domestic illusion?" The voice was like an oil slick on wet pavement. Chloe felt Alexander's muscles turn to solid granite against her. They turned to find Marcus Langdon standing there nursing a martini. His eyes raked over Chloe's body in a way that made her skin crawl with disgust. "Marcus," Alexander acknowledged his tone, carrying a lethal warning. "So the ridiculous rumor is true," Marcus sneered, stepping closer. "The little waitress from the Apex. You really scrubbed her up well, Alexander. Tell me, how much did the dress cost, because I know for a fact it's worth more than her entire life." Alexander took a threatening step forward, the temperature in the room plummeting, but Chloe squeezed his arm hard. She remembered the contract. She was the shield. She stepped smoothly in front of Alexander. She looked Marcus dead in the eye, channeling the exhaustion of every unpaid bill, the terror of Lily's hospital room, and the sharp intellect she had honed in law school. "It's Chloe, actually," she said, her voice ringing out clear, steady, and devastatingly cold. "And regarding my worth, Mr. Langdon, I am the woman who made Alexander Thorne change his entire life. Meanwhile, from what I hear about your Silicon Valley portfolio, the only thing you've managed to change recently is your credit rating. It must be exhausting, trying to buy respect when you clearly lack the intellect to earn it." The silence that engulfed their immediate circle was deafening. Alexander didn't move a muscle, but the corner of his mouth twitched upward in a dark, triumphant smirk. Marcus's face turned a violent, ugly shade of magenta. "You have a very sharp tongue for a hired girl," Marcus hissed, his facade crumbling. "Be careful you don't cut your own throat with it." "Is that a threat, Marcus?" Alexander asked softly. The corporate CEO was gone. The executioner was back. "Because if you threaten my future wife in public, I won't wait for the board meeting to destroy you. I will finish this right here on the museum floor." Marcus glared, his jaw working furiously. "Enjoy the party, Alexander, while it lasts." He stormed off, completely humiliated in front of the surrounding elites. "You have a literal death wish," Alexander hissed as he immediately steered her toward the bar, his hand gripping hers with white-knuckled intensity. "I was defending you," Chloe retorted, her heart hammering. "I do not need defending. I need you to stay alive." Alexander ordered a whiskey neat and downed it in one swallow. He looked at her, his icy eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and raw, undeniable attraction. But that was spectacularly ruthless. "I hate him," Chloe admitted, her hands trembling slightly now that the adrenaline was fading. "He is desperate, which makes him dangerous," Alexander said, his eyes scanning the room, constantly checking exits and hands. "Dance with me." "What?" "Langdon is watching from the balcony. We need to sell the illusion. We need to look madly in love." Alexander didn't wait for an answer. He pulled her onto the polished marble dance floor. The orchestra was playing a slow, sweeping waltz. Alexander pulled her firmly into his frame, his large hand warm and possessive on her bare back, guiding her effortlessly. For a brief suspended moment, Chloe forgot about the contract. She forgot about the danger. She only felt the solid strength of his body against hers, moving in perfect synchronization. "You are an excellent dancer for a ruthless CEO," she murmured, looking up into his face. "A man who cannot lead on the floor, cannot lead in the boardroom," Alexander replied softly. His gaze dropped to her lips, the intensity between them suddenly suffocating. "Chloe, earlier when you called me that, baby," she teased softly, emboldened by the intoxicating atmosphere. "Stop," he warned, though his voice was strained heavy with want. "Why did you say it?" "You were talking to your niece." "I know, but when I said it, I wasn't looking at my microphone." Chloe felt a deep flush rise up her neck. "I was looking at you." Alexander leaned closer, his lips brushing against her temple. "Then, perhaps, fake wife, we are both in much more trouble than we realized." Suddenly, Alexander froze, the intoxicating romantic tension evaporating in a fraction of a second, completely replaced by a cold, deadly stillness. He wasn't looking at her lips anymore. His icy blue eyes were fixed intensely on something over her shoulder. "Alexander," Chloe whispered, feeling the muscles in his back turn to solid iron under her hands. Through the swirling, elegant crowd of designer gowns and bespoke tuxedos, a waiter was moving toward them. He carried a silver tray of champagne flutes, but his eyes were entirely locked on Alexander's back. His path was too direct, his pace too purposeful for a simple server, and his right hand was sliding subtly beneath the thick white linen napkin draped over the tray. "Down!" Alexander roared. With terrifying speed and raw physical force, he shoved Chloe backward, sending her crashing hard to the cold marble floor. Pop, 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 3. Suppressed gunshots tore through the exact physical space where Chloe's head had been a mere second prior. A massive crystal ice sculpture standing right beside them shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces, showering the dance floor like deadly rain. Chaos erupted instantly. Blood-curdling screams ripped through the museum hall. The orchestra stopped with a discordant screech of strings. The elite attendees of the charity gala scrambled in blind, animalistic panic, trampling each other in a desperate stampede toward the museum's bronze exits. Chloe scrambled backward, her hands scraping against the broken ice and shattered crystal. She looked up fully expecting to see Alexander running for cover to save his own life. He wasn't running. He was charging. The assassin, dressed in the pristine waiter's uniform, quickly raised the suppressed pistol to take another shot. But Alexander was already on him. The billionaire moved with a brutal, calculating violence that was horrifying to witness. He grabbed the assassin's wrist, twisting it sharply upward with a sickening crack of breaking bone. The gun clattered harmlessly to the marble floor. Alexander drove his knee violently into the man's abdomen, folding him in half, then grabbed him by the throat and slammed him backward against a towering stone pillar. "Who sent you?" Alexander snarled, his voice a demonic roar that echoed powerfully over the screaming crowd. The assassin choked blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth and desperately reached for a tactical knife strapped concealed at his waist. Alexander didn't hesitate. He drew his own weapon, a sleek, custom silver pistol, from his concealed shoulder holster and viciously pistol-whipped the man across the temple. The assassin crumpled lifelessly to the floor, completely unconscious. The immediate physical threat neutralized. Alexander spun around. His chest heaved, his eyes wide and uncharacteristically frantic. The terrifying, calculating CEO was gone instantly, replaced by a man gripped by pure, unadulterated terror. He scanned the chaotic, debris-filled floor until his eyes locked onto Chloe. She was sitting amidst the ruin, shaking violently, her stunning red silk dress torn at the hem. A slow, steady trickle of blood ran down her left arm, where she had fallen onto the jagged crystal shards. Alexander holstered his weapon and sprinted to her, sliding to his knees, right in the middle of the broken glass, completely ignoring the sharp cuts to his own tailored trousers. Chloe, look at me." He grabbed her shoulders, his large hands frantically sweeping over her body, checking for bullet wounds. "Are you hit? Where is the blood coming from? I'm okay," She gasped, her ears still ringing painfully from the gunshots. "It's just my arm. The glass." Alexander stared at the bleeding cut on her arm. His expression hardened into something so dark and lethal it made the air around them drop 10 degrees. He ripped his perfectly folded silk pocket square from his jacket and pressed it firmly against her wound to stop the bleeding. "Elias," Alexander bellowed without looking away from her pale face. His massive head of security materialized through the panicked crowd, his gun drawn, followed closely by a team of heavily armed tactical guards. "Exits are secured, sir. It was a lone hitter. Langdon's detail vanished the exact second the shots were fired." "Get the car," Alexander commanded, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, suppressed rage. "We are leaving immediately. If anyone tries to stop us, shoot them." Without waiting for another word, Alexander scooped Chloe up into his arms as if she weighed absolutely nothing. She instinctively buried her face in his neck, breathing in the comforting scent of gunpowder mixed with his sharp cedar cologne. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice trembling uncontrollably as the massive adrenaline crash finally began to set in. "I told you," Alexander growled, his jaw locked tight as he carried her through the fleeing, screaming crowd. "I protect what is mine, and Marcus Langdon just signed his own death warrant." The drive out of Manhattan was a tense, high-speed blur. The armored SUV tore through the rain-slicked streets, flanked aggressively by 2 other black vehicles from Alexander's security detail. Inside the dark cabin, the silence was deafening. Chloe sat huddled in the corner of the leather seat, wrapped tightly in Alexander's heavy suit jacket, shivering violently. Alexander sat rigidly beside her, furiously typing on his encrypted phone, already orchestrating a massive corporate and physical retaliation. But every few minutes, his icy blue eyes would dart over to her, checking to ensure she was still breathing, still whole. The safe house wasn't a bunker. It was a sprawling, ultra-modern compound perched precariously on the edge of the cliffs in Montauk, Long Island. The stormy Atlantic Ocean crashed violently against the rocks below, the aggressive sound perfectly mirroring the absolute chaos raging inside Alexander's mind. It had been over 2 hours since the shooting at the museum. Alexander hadn't spoken a single word since he carried Chloe out of the vehicle and into the heavily fortified house. He had deposited her in the master bathroom, a massive space of dark slate and stark white towels. "Sit," he finally commanded, his voice rougher than coarse gravel. Chloe sat on the edge of the wide marble bathtub. She was still shivering, the psychological shock fully taking over her system. Alexander washed his hands in the sink with a surgical, punishing precision, the water running a faint pink as he scrubbed the assassin's blood from his bruised knuckles. He couldn't bring himself to look at her in the mirror. If he looked at her, he would see the terrified, innocent girl he had selfishly dragged into his incredibly violent world. He turned off the gold tap, forcefully dried his hands, and grabbed a premium first aid kit from the wall cabinet. He knelt directly between her legs just as he had on the museum floor, but this time the adrenaline was completely gone. It was replaced by a cold, suffocating, agonizing wave of guilt. "Give me your arm," he murmured softly. Chloe extended her trembling arm. The cut wasn't dangerously deep, but it was ugly and jagged. Alexander cleaned it with antiseptic, his touch shockingly, heartbreakingly gentle, for a man who had just brutally dismantled an assassin. Chloe hissed in pain, flinching instinctively. "I'm sorry," Alexander whispered. He paused, and she realized with absolute shock that his large hands, the hands that effortlessly controlled billions of dollars and destroyed powerful men's lives, were actually trembling. "I am so incredibly sorry, Chloe." "It's not your fault," she said quietly. "It is entirely my fault." Alexander didn't look up. He focused intensely on applying a sterile butterfly bandage to the cut. "I dragged you directly into the spotlight. I put a massive target on your back just to take it off mine. I was arrogant. I thought I could completely control the board and the players. Tonight proved that I cannot protect you." He finished applying the bandage and slowly looked up. His piercing blue eyes were haunted, completely stripped of their usual icy armor, filled with a raw vulnerability he had never shown to another living soul. "The contract is void," Alexander stated flatly. Chloe blinked, her heart suddenly dropping into her stomach. "What?" "Elias is waiting outside right now. He has a private chopper ready. He is going to take you to a secured airfield. You will be flown to a secluded estate I own in Switzerland. You will stay there under heavy guard until I wipe Langdon off the face of the earth. Once it's fully safe, you will be given a new identity, a new life, and the $5 million. You will never have to see me again." He stood up abruptly and turned his back to her, unable to bear the sight of the physical evidence of his failure on her skin. "Your niece's medical bills will be paid for the rest of her life. You are free, but you are done with Alexander Thorne." Chloe stared at his broad, tense back. She saw the heavy, crushing isolation of a man who genuinely believed he was a fatal poison to everything he touched. She thought about the immediate, visceral way he had thrown his own body over hers to shield her from the bullets. Most women would run. Most women would gladly take the millions, flee to Switzerland, and thank God they survived the ordeal. But Chloe Adams was a fighter. She had spent her entire life fighting for her family, fighting for her education, and fighting for basic survival. She wasn't going to run from the only man who had ever made her feel truly, profoundly safe. She stood up, completely ignoring the dull ache radiating from her arm, and walked deliberately over to him. She placed her uninjured hand flat against the center of his tense back. Alexander flinched violently, as if her gentle touch burned right through his shirt. "Do not touch me, Chloe." "No," she said simply. Alexander turned around. His expression caught somewhere between explosive fury and profound disbelief. "Did you not hear a single word I just said? They shot at you. They tried to kill you next time they might not miss. If you stay anywhere near me, you could die." "If I leave now, Marcus Langdon wins," Chloe argued, her voice gaining sudden strength, echoing loudly off the dark slate walls. "If I suddenly disappear to Switzerland, Langdon knows he terrified you. He knows he actually found your weak spot. He will hunt you down, Alexander. And then he'll hunt me down anyway, because I'm a loose end. You cannot just send me away. I can protect you infinitely better if you are an ocean away." Alexander roared, his immense volume desperately masking his deep-seated terror. "And who protects you?" Chloe shouted back, thick tears finally spilling over her dark eyelashes. The silence that aggressively crashed down upon the bathroom was heavy-charged and utterly suffocating. Alexander stared down at her completely and entirely stunned by the fierce, unwavering loyalty burning fiercely in her hazel eyes. "I have an army." Alexander finally gritted out, his voice a low, defensive tremor. "I have elite security teams who are paid millions to take a bullet for me." "They are paid to protect the CEO of Thorne Enterprises," Chloe countered, taking another step closer until her toes brushed against his leather shoes. She tilted her head back, refusing to back down from his intimidating height. "They protect the corporate asset. They protect the stock price. But who protects Alexander? Who actually cares if you live or die other than your board of directors?" The silence that followed was absolute. Alexander stared down at her, completely stunned. "I am not leaving," Chloe stated firmly, her voice carrying a quiet, unshakable authority. "We signed a contract. 6 months. I am a law student. I do not break my legal agreements, Alexander, and I absolutely refuse to let a coward like Marcus Langdon dictate where I live or who I stand beside." Alexander looked down into her fierce, beautiful hazel eyes. He saw the stubborn fire burning there, a defiant spark that refused to be extinguished by the dark reality of his world. He felt a massive, impenetrable wall inside his chest, a wall he had spent decades building to survive the cutthroat corporate underworld, finally crack and crumble into dust. "You are an incredibly foolish woman," he whispered, though there was no anger left in his voice, only a profound, overwhelming awe. "And you are a terrible boss." Chloe counted a shaky, breathless laugh escaping her lips. "You haven't even asked if I'm hungry after being shot at." Alexander let out a ragged breath that was half laugh, half groan. He reached out his large hands, gently cupping her face, his thumbs lightly tracing the high curve of her cheekbones. The physical contact sent a violent jolt of electricity straight to Chloe's core. "Chloe," he breathed, his voice dropping to that dangerous velvet whisper that made her knees weak. "If you stay, I swear to God I will burn this entire city to ash before I let them touch you again." "I know," she whispered. The air between them crackled with an unbearable, suffocating heat. His lips hovered mere inches from hers, testing the invisible boundary they had set on the very first night, waiting for her to pull away. When she didn't, when her eyelids fluttered shut, and she leaned imperceptibly closer, Alexander closed the distance. The kiss was not gentle. It was desperate, commanding, and wildly possessive. It tasted of expensive whiskey, lingering adrenaline, and raw survival. Alexander kissed her like he was a drowning man, and she was his only source of oxygen. His hands tangled violently in the thick waves of her dark hair, pulling her flush against his solid chest. Chloe wrapped her arms tightly around his neck, pulling him closer, acting as an anchor to keep him tethered to the earth. For a breathless, suspended moment, there was no corporate war, no assassins, no billions of dollars at stake. There was just the blinding heat of two people who had looked death in the face and actively chosen each other. Alexander suddenly pulled back his chest, heaving his forehead resting heavily against hers. His icy blue eyes were entirely black with desire. "You gave me permission," he reminded her. His voice a low, raspy growl. "I did," Chloe gasped, her lips swollen and tingling. "If I don't stop now, Chloe, I won't stop at all," he warned, his hands gripping her waist tightly. "And you have been through enough trauma for one night. Go to sleep. You're safe here." That night, lying in the massive king-size bed in the Montauk safe house, the invisible line dividing the mattress completely vanished. While the storm raged violently outside, violently thrashing against the bulletproof windows, Chloe fell asleep, securely wrapped in Alexander's arms, her head resting over his fiercely beating heart. The fake marriage had officially become terrifyingly real. Underscore 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 underscore. However, the agonizing reality of their situation crashed down upon them over the next 3 weeks. The corporate war with Marcus Langdon had devolved into a toxic, bleeding stalemate, and the silence from the enemy camp was infinitely worse than the gunfire. They remained trapped at the Montauk compound. Business at Thorne Enterprises was hemorrhaging rapidly. Highly confidential shipments were being intercepted by federal regulators. Key corporate acquisitions were being swooped up by Langdon's shell companies hours before Alexander could finalize the paperwork. The atmosphere inside the safe house grew suffocatingly tense. Alexander was barely sleeping, running his empire from a heavily encrypted war room on the ground floor. It was a bleak Tuesday night. Heavy rain lashed against the estate. Chloe, wearing one of Alexander's oversized dress shirts and a pair of reading glasses, walked quietly down the hallway toward the war room. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar, allowing her to hear the heated voices inside. "We just lost the New Jersey logistics depot," Elias said, his voice thick with frustration. He was pacing the floor, a tablet gripped tightly in his hand. "The SEC was waiting with a federal injunction. They knew the exact holding company we were using, Alexander." "Exact." Alexander sat at the head of a massive oak table, staring at a wall of glowing monitors. He looked exhausted, the sharp angles of his jaw tight with suppressed fury. Only 3 people in this entire organization knew that specific corporate structure. Me, you, and Harrison. Harrison, Alexander's sleek, silver-haired chief legal officer, sighed heavily from his seat. "Langdon has incredibly deep pockets, Alexander. He could have easily bribed someone at the SEC or the state registry. We are bleeding capital. If we don't retaliate physically, the board is going to file a vote of no confidence." "I am not initiating a physical bloodbath and risking federal prison." Alexander snapped, his voice cold and lethal. "Langdon is anticipating every single financial maneuver we make. He has our exact blueprints. There is a leak. Someone inside my inner circle is feeding him our encrypted ledgers. Then we have to purge the executive suite, Elias suggested grimly. Fire everyone and rebuild. It's not the executive suite. The three powerful men immediately turned toward the doorway. Chloe stood there holding a massive stack of printed financial spreadsheets she had spent the last 48 hours secretly compiling from Alexander's unlocked server. Chloe, go back upstairs. Alexander warned, his tone immediately protective but sharp. This is highly dangerous. It is not for you. You are losing this war because you are looking for a corporate spy, Chloe said, ignoring his warning completely. She walked confidently into the room, her bare feet silent on the rug, and slammed the heavy stack of papers down right in the middle of the war table. You don't need a spy hunter, Alexander. You need a forensic accountant. Harrison chuckled condescendingly, leaning back in his leather chair. My dear girl, please stick to choosing the floral arrangements for the wedding. Leave the multi-billion-dollar corporate warfare to the professionals. Chloe turned her gaze slowly to Harrison. It was the exact same icy dissecting look Alexander used to terrify his enemies. I am a top-tier law student, Harrison, Chloe said, her voice dripping with lethal precision. I specialize in corporate liability tax loopholes and forensic accounting. And frankly, your shell companies are an absolute sloppy disaster. The war room went dead silent. Alexander sat up straighter, his eyes locked onto Chloe with intense fascination. Explain, Alexander commanded. Chloe ignored Harrison's venomous glare and spread the heavily highlighted spreadsheets across the polished oak table. The glowing light from the tactical monitors cast long, dramatic shadows across her determined face. I couldn't sleep, so I started looking through the acquisition logs for the New Jersey depot. Chloe began, her voice steady and professional sounding, exactly like a seasoned prosecutor. Specifically, I looked at the primary shell corporation that formally holds the deed, Thorne Logistics LLC, registered in the Cayman Islands. It all looks like standard corporate structuring. Because it is standard, Harrison snapped, leaning forward, which you would know if you had actually passed the bar exam. Let her speak, Alexander commanded. His voice was dangerously soft, his eyes fixed intently on Chloe's face. Chloe slid a specific document toward Alexander. It looks standard, until you audit the operational expenses. The annual registration and filing fees for Thorne Logistics aren't being paid from the main corporate treasury account. They're being routed and paid by a secondary heavily obscured LLC called Janus Global. Elias frowned, leaning over the table to look at the highlighted numbers. So, we use dozens of secondary holding companies to obscure paper trails. So, Chloe continued, her finger tapping the paper with rhythmic precision. I did a deep dive into Janus Global. It's a complete ghost company. No physical address, no payroll, no operational history. But I tracked the digital tax filings. The IP address used to manually file their corporate tax returns last quarter didn't originate from a secure Thorne Enterprises server. It traced back to a private residential internet provider in the Hamptons. She turned slowly, locking her hazel eyes directly onto the chief legal officer. Harrison, Chloe said, her voice dropping to a lethal chill. Don't you have a private summer estate in East Hampton? The color drained from Harrison's face with terrifying speed. His sophisticated, arrogant demeanor evaporated, leaving behind a sickly pale sheen of panic. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. This is completely ridiculous, Harrison stammered, backing away from the table. She is hacking our highly classified servers, Alexander. She is a massive security risk. Langdon probably planted her at that club. She is entirely right, Alexander said softly. Alexander wasn't looking at the spreadsheets. He was looking directly at Harrison. The billionaire slowly stood up, his massive frame radiating an overwhelming, suffocating menace. The executioner had found his prey. The IP address, Harrison. Is it registered to your estate? Alexander's voice was completely devoid of emotion, a terrifying void that promised absolute destruction. Alexander, I have served your father. I have served you for 15 years. Harrison pleaded, his hands trembling wildly. The exact container number for the New Jersey shipment, Chloe cut in, absolutely ruthless in her delivery. "It was only listed on the highly classified legal manifest sent to our internal insurance adjuster. You are the only person who officially handles and signs off on the insurance manifests, Harrison." Harrison hit the wall, literally cornered. His breathing was ragged, his eyes darting frantically between Alexander and Elias. "Langdon offered me a way out!" Harrison suddenly screamed, his facade completely shattering. The SEC is secretly building a massive federal case against Thorne Enterprises. Alexander Langdon promised me full corporate immunity and a board seat at his firm. I didn't want to die in federal prison because of your reckless expansion. "So you sold my company?" Alexander asked, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "You sold out my men. You sold her out to the assassins at the gala." "She is absolutely nothing," Harrison spat aggressively, pointing a trembling finger at Chloe. "She is a cheap waitress, a distraction. You are actively losing your edge, Alexander. You are becoming weak because you are obsessed with her." In a surge of blind, terrified desperation, Harrison's hand darted inside his tailored jacket, reaching for the concealed weapon he carried. "Don't!" Alexander warned. But Harrison, driven mad by fear, pulled a compact pistol. Before he could even level the barrel at Alexander, a deafening boom echoed through the war room. Harrison dropped hard to his knees, a look of profound shock freezing on his face before he collapsed forward onto the expensive Persian rug. Chloe screamed instinctively, throwing her hands over her ears. Alexander stood completely still at the head of the table. His right arm fully extended, a thin trail of gray smoke curling from the barrel of his silver-suppressed pistol. He hadn't flinched. He hadn't hesitated for a microsecond. The ruthless CEO had just executed a traitor in cold blood. Elias moved instantly smoothly, stepping over to check the body. "He's gone, boss," Elias confirmed quietly, expertly kicking Harrison's weapon out of reach. Alexander didn't immediately lower his gun. He stared blankly at the body of the man who had been a trusted advisor for over a decade. The betrayal cut deep, but the survival of his empire and the safety of the woman standing across the room required absolute ruthlessness. Slowly, Alexander holstered his weapon. He turned his gaze to Chloe. She was violently shaking, her wide eyes glued to the lifeless body on the floor. Alexander expected her to recoil in absolute horror. He had just revealed the darkest, most monstrous part of his world to her. He braced himself for her to finally run. "Chloe," Alexander said cautiously, taking a hesitant step toward her. Chloe tore her eyes away from the floor and looked up at him. Her face was deathly pale, but her jaw was set with a fierce, unbreakable determination. "He was going to shoot you," she whispered, her voice surprisingly steady. "Yes. Then you didn't have a choice." Alexander let out a ragged, heavy breath. The immense weight crushing his chest finally cracked. In 2 massive strides, he crossed the room and pulled her fiercely into his arms, burying his face deep into her dark hair. She smelled of vanilla and the clean, fresh rain, the only pure, untainted thing left in his incredibly dirty world. "You found the rat," Alexander murmured against her temple, his large hands gripping her, as if she were the only thing keeping him from falling off the edge of the earth. "You saved my empire, Chloe. You saved us." "I told you," she mumbled against his solid chest, her hands tightly gripping the lapels of his shirt to anchor herself. "I'm not just a pretty face." He pulled back, just enough to look deeply into her eyes. He looked at her with a potent mixture of raw awe, profound respect, and an undeniable consuming hunger. The adrenaline of the kill and the overwhelming relief of survival were mixing into a highly volatile cocktail. "Elias," Alexander commanded, his eyes never leaving Chloe's face, "clean this mess up. Assemble the tactical strike team. Now that we know exactly what Langdon's playbook is, this corporate war ends tonight." "Yes, sir," Elias replied, already pulling out his encrypted phone. Alexander took Chloe's hand, his grip warm and fiercely possessive. "Come with me." He led her out of the war room, but not toward the kitchen or the living area. He led her straight up the grand staircase to the master bedroom. He pulled her inside, kicked the heavy oak door shut, and locked it with a definitive click. The storm raged violently against the floor-to-ceiling windows, but the storm brewing inside the room was infinitely fiercer. "You just watched me kill a man," Alexander said, backing her slowly against the heavy wooden door. His chest heaved, his icy eyes burning with dark intensity. "And you still didn't run." "I'm entirely done running, Alexander," Chloe said. She reached up her trembling fingers, deftly unbuttoning the top collar of his shirt. Her hands were shaking violently, but it wasn't from fear anymore. Alexander groaned a low, animalistic sound of pure surrender. He crashed his lips down onto hers, kissing her with a ferocious, breathtaking intensity that bordered on violence. He lifted her effortlessly off the floor, her legs wrapping instinctively around his narrow waist, and carried her straight to the massive bed. "Say it," he growled against the sensitive skin of her neck as they fell backward onto the soft mattress. "Say what?" she gasped, arching into his touch. He pulled back his icy blue eyes, burning right through her soul. "Call me what you called me that very first night in the club. Call me what makes you entirely mine." Chloe ran her fingers passionately through his dark hair, pulling his face down to hers. "Baby," she whispered. Alexander Thorne, the ruthless executioner of New York, completely and utterly surrendered. The morning after Harrison's execution, the violent coastal storm had finally broken, leaving behind a cold, razor-sharp New York skyline. But inside the glass and steel fortress of Thorne Enterprises, a completely different kind of storm was just making landfall. Armed with the forensic accounting trail Chloe had meticulously decrypted, Alexander didn't just plan a physical retaliation. He orchestrated a complete and total financial annihilation. He sat at the head of the obsidian conference table at his corporate headquarters, flanked by his new heavily vetted executive team. Elias stood by the heavy mahogany doors, a silent, heavily armed sentinel. "Execute the short squeeze," Alexander commanded, his voice a low, lethal hum that vibrated through the room. "Dump all the secondary shell stocks associated with his portfolio. Concurrently flood the market and the press with the undeniable evidence of Langdon's SEC violations. I want him bleeding capital before Wall Street even finishes its morning coffee." Within 60 minutes, the financial district was in a state of absolute, unmitigated pandemonium. The carefully constructed house of cards that Marcus Langdon had built over decades began to violently collapse. The anonymous, highly encrypted tip containing Chloe's undeniable proof of Langdon's embezzlement, massive offshore tax evasion, and illegal corporate espionage hit the federal regulator's desk simultaneously with every major news outlet in the country. Langdon's stock plummeted into a freefall, triggering automatic sell-offs across the globe. By noon, Marcus Langdon's private sanctuary, a sprawling, ultra-modern glass compound hidden deep in the Catskills, was no longer a safe haven. It was a tomb. When you are rapidly bleeding billions and your private security contractors realize your payroll checks are going to bounce, unwavering loyalty evaporates instantly. Alexander's convoy of armored SUVs pulled silently up to the heavy iron gates. There was no gunfire, no dramatic physical siege. Elias simply rolled down his window and handed a sleek steel briefcase to the head of Langdon's private security detail. Inside was a verified wire transfer confirmation that significantly dwarfed their combined annual salaries. The heavy iron gates swung open smoothly. The mercenaries simply walked away, leaving their boss completely defenseless. Alexander walked into Langdon's private, heavily fortified study, accompanied only by Elias. The rival CEO was frantically tearing through a wall safe, packing a canvas duffel bag with thick stacks of foreign currency-bearer bonds and pristine forged passports. His face was pale, his silk shirt entirely soaked in a cold, panicked sweat. "Going somewhere, Marcus?" Alexander asked softly, stepping fully into the center of the room. Marcus violently flinched, dropping a heavy stack of Swiss francs. He spun around, his eyes wide with a feral, cornered panic. "How the hell did you get in here? Where are my guards?" "Your guards are currently updating their resumes and enjoying a very early retirement," Alexander replied smoothly. He casually unbuttoned his bespoke suit jacket and sat down in one of the plush leather armchairs across from the massive mahogany desk. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't have to. His mere presence in the room was a definitive death sentence. It is truly fascinating, Marcus, how quickly your perceived power dissipates when the money stops flowing. The feds are freezing my accounts, Marcus stammered, backing aggressively against the wall until his shoulders hit the plaster. You tipped them off. You found the Janus global accounts. How Harrison promised me that encrypted server was completely impenetrable. Harrison is currently indisposed. Permanently, Alexander stated, his icy blue eyes locking onto Marcus with the crushing, inescapable pressure of the deep ocean. And you made one fatal miscalculation in this war. You profoundly underestimated the woman you so arrogantly insulted at the charity gala. It was Chloe who dismantled your entire empire. She found the leak. She found the offshore ledgers. A cheap waitress completely outsmarted your entire financial division. Marcus swallowed hard, looking physically ill as the horrifying reality of his defeat finally set in. What do you want, Alexander? My stock is completely tanking. The federal regulators are currently issuing a warrant for my arrest. You've won. You have completely ruined me. Elias stepped forward from the shadows and placed a thick legal manila folder firmly on the desk. I am an exceptionally generous man, Alexander said, softly leaning forward. Inside that folder is a complete, irrevocable transfer of ownership. You will sign over your remaining Silicon Valley assets, the highly lucrative logistics routes in New Jersey, and all voting rights on your corporate board directly to Thorne Enterprises. If I do that, I have absolutely nothing left on, Marcus shouted desperately, tears of sheer frustration pricking his eyes. If you do not do that, Alexander countered, his voice dropping to a terrifying absolute zero. Elias will not be leaving this room with you alive. The physical retaliation for the assassination attempt on my future wife's life has not even begun yet. The federal regulators want you in a concrete cell for the rest of your life. I simply want you erased. This folder is your only exit. Marcus looked at the heavily armed head of security, who slowly rested his hand on the grip of his holstered weapon. Then he looked at the completely remorseless executioner of Wall Street. With violently shaking, defeated hands, Marcus Langdon took the heavy gold pen from his desk and signed his entire legacy away. You have a private jet waiting fully fueled at a secluded strip in Teterboro, Alexander said, standing up and elegantly adjusting his cuffs. It has enough fuel to reach a non-extradition country in South America. If I ever see your face in this city again, I will not send my lawyers to deal with it. I will send Elias. By the time Alexander's helicopter landed back at the Montauk safe house, the sun was beginning to set over the violent Atlantic, painting the sky in deep, bruised shades of purple, crimson, and gold. The corporate war was officially over. The Thorne Empire was not just secure, it had effectively doubled in size and absolute power. No one in the global financial sector would ever dare challenge Alexander Thorne again. He found Chloe in the expansive multi-level library. She was curled up in a massive leather reading chair, a heavy constitutional law textbook resting completely forgotten on her lap. She looked up as he entered the room, her hazel eyes instantly searching his exhausted face for signs of damage. Is it over? She asked softly, gently closing the book. Alexander walked over the heavy, suffocating burden of the past few weeks, finally lifting from his broad shoulders. He pulled her gently from the chair and wrapped her securely in his arms, burying his face in the crook of her neck, breathing in the intoxicating scent of vanilla that always brought him back to center. It is completely over, he murmured, his deep voice vibrating against her skin. Langdon is gone. The corporate board is entirely stabilized. You are completely safe, Chloe. Chloe wrapped her arms tightly around his narrow waist, holding him securely against her. She listened to the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart. But as they stood there in the quiet, golden warmth of the library, a new, completely different kind of tension began to settle heavily over them. The external enemy was permanently destroyed. The immediate life-threatening danger had officially passed. But that terrifyingly meant the 6-month deadline on their fake marriage contract was rapidly approaching. Without the threat of assassins or corporate espionage binding them together, neither of them knew exactly how to survive the impending peace or how to admit that the fake contract was the most real thing that had ever happened to them. 2 months later, the exact 6-month mark of their signed agreement quietly arrived. The sprawling penthouse overlooking Central Park was painfully quiet. The heavy, relentless rain had returned to New York City, violently washing away the grime of the streets below. Inside the master suite, Chloe was packing. She wasn't packing the breathtaking designer gowns, the priceless diamond necklaces, or the custom silk lingerie Alexander had lavishly bought for her. She was carefully folding her old worn-out jeans, her oversized college sweaters, and her scuffed sneakers. She heard the heavy oak door open behind her. Alexander walked in. He looked devastatingly handsome in a charcoal bespoke suit, but the sharp angles of his jaw were tight, a dangerous muscle feathering in his cheek. He was holding a thick, unmarked manila envelope. He stopped completely still when he saw the battered canvas suitcase lying open on the king-size bed. "You are packing," he stated, his voice completely hollow, stripped of all its usual commanding resonance. "It has been exactly 6 months today, Alexander," Chloe said quietly, not looking at him as she folded a faded law school t-shirt with violently trembling hands. "The contract is formally up. Langdon is permanently gone. You won the corporate war. The board is secure." Alexander walked slowly across the room and placed the heavy envelope on the edge of the mattress. "This is it," he said, his tone perfectly flat and strictly professional. $5 million, completely tax-free, fully washed, and cleanly wired to a highly secured offshore account in Zurich. Inside is also the deed to a massive, fully staffed apartment in Paris. It is entirely yours. Chloe finally stopped packing. She looked down at the thick envelope. It was absolutely everything she had ever desperately wanted. Total financial freedom guaranteed, absolute safety for her niece Lily, a brand new life without struggle. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking under the crushing weight of her own heartbreak. "You fulfilled your exact end of the bargain," Alexander said, turning his face away to stare blankly out the rain-slicked windows. The impenetrable icy walls were fully back up. "You were an absolutely perfect shield." "Is that honestly all I was to you?" Chloe asked, finally turning around to look at his broad, tense back. "A corporate shield." Alexander aggressively gripped the marble windowsill until his knuckles turned completely white. "It is exactly what you legally agreed to be." "That is absolutely not what I asked, Alexander." "Chloe, just leave," Alexander suddenly roared, spinning around, his icy blue eyes blazing with a tormented, agonizing pain. "Take the money and get out. You do not belong in this violent, disgusting world. You saw what I did to Harrison in that war room. You saw the blood on my hands. I am a ruthless monster who executes his own men to maintain power. You are entirely too good, too pure to be dragged down into my darkness." "I know exactly who you are," Chloe said softly. She walked deliberately across the plush carpet, stopping just inches behind him. "But you didn't force me to stay at the Montauk safe house when the bullets were flying. You didn't force me to analyze those encrypted financial ledgers. I chose this. I chose to fight for you." "You chose survival," Alexander shouted, his massive chest heaving. "But you do not have to just survive anymore. You can actually live. Go to Paris. Go find a nice, safe corporate lawyer or a doctor. Find a soft, decent man who comes home right at 5:00 p.m. and doesn't have to check his vehicle for explosives." "I do not want a nice, safe lawyer," Chloe yelled back, hot tears finally springing to her eyes. "I want you. Why?" Alexander roared, the absolute agonizing pain finally breaking completely through his terrifying facade. "Why would you ever actively want a life of constantly looking over your shoulder?" "Because when I look over my shoulder, you are the one standing there protecting me," Chloe said, her voice breaking on a sob. "Because you saved my niece's life without ever asking for a single thing in return. Because you treat me like a brilliant equal, not just a beautiful prop. Because I love you, you absolute idiot." The silence that aggressively crashed down upon the master suite was heavy, filled only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the glass. Alexander stared down at her, utterly paralyzed. The most feared, ruthless man on Wall Street looked completely and totally defeated by a girl in a faded college sweatshirt. "You love me," he whispered, his voice cracking, sounding as if the words were a completely foreign language he had never been taught to speak. "Yes." Chloe stepped closer, bravely placing her small hands flat against his chest, right over his racing heart. "I love the ruthless monster, and I love the man. I love the way you look at me when you think I am not paying attention." She reached up with trembling fingers and slowly pulled the flawless emerald-cut diamond ring off her finger. She took his large hand and firmly pressed his mother's ring right into his palm. "If you truly want me to leave Alexander, then look me dead in the eye and tell me to go," she challenged fiercely. "Look me in the eye and tell me I was just a highly paid employee. Tell me you feel absolutely nothing." Alexander looked down at the massive diamond resting in his palm. Then he looked at Chloe. The thick, icy walls completely shattered. The executioner surrendered. He dropped the priceless ring onto the floor and aggressively grabbed her, pulling her into a crushing, desperate embrace. He lifted her effortlessly off the ground, burying his face deep into the crook of her neck. "I can't," he groaned, the sound torn from the very depths of his soul. "God help me, Chloe, I cannot let you go. You are the only thing in my entire life that makes sense. You are the only light I have ever had." He set her down slowly, but refused to let her go. He framed her face with his large, shaking hands, his piercing eyes searching hers with intense, overwhelming devotion. "If you stay," Alexander warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous, possessive growl. "There is absolutely no going back, no Paris apartment, no escape. You will be entirely mine until the day I die, and I will violently burn the world down to keep you safe every single day." Chloe smiled brilliantly, reaching up to gently wipe a stray tear from his sharp cheekbone. "I don't want Paris," she whispered. "I want to be right here." Alexander bent down and picked up the ring from the carpet. His massive hands, usually so incredibly steady when holding a weapon, were shaking slightly as he carefully slid the diamond back onto her finger. "Then stay," he commanded softly, getting down on one knee. "Marry me for real. Be my wife. Be the untouchable queen of this city." Chloe looked at the blinding diamond, then down at the terrifying billionaire who would kill and die for her. "Yes," she breathed. Alexander stood up, that old dark arrogance returning to his face, but now it was beautifully tempered with a deep, abiding love. He pulled her flush against him, his lips hovering dangerously over hers. "Good choice," he murmured. "Now come here, baby." Chloe laughed against his mouth, wrapping her arms securely around his neck. "Say it again," she challenged playfully. Alexander captured her lips in a searing, breathtaking kiss that promised absolute forever. "I love you," he whispered against her mouth. "Is that slow enough? Underscore, 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 underscore. The official wedding of Alexander Thorne and Chloe Adams was the corporate and social event of the decade. They didn't hide, and they certainly didn't elope. They married in a grand, spectacular ceremony at St. Patrick's Cathedral, with the entire city watching. It was a massive, undeniable statement of power. The ruthless lion had finally found his fierce lioness, and Thorne Enterprises was completely untouchable. Chloe didn't just spend his money. She graduated at the absolute top of her law school class. She immediately became the chief legal officer for Thorne Enterprises, transforming his massive corporate empire into an impenetrable fortress of legal steel. She became the brilliant velvet glove perfectly covering Alexander's violent iron fist. 2 years later, inside the heavily guarded VIP section of the Apex Lounge, the jazz music was smooth and the high-end bourbon was flowing. At table 4, the most powerful feared couple in New York City sat completely relaxed. A young, incredibly nervous new waiter approached with a silver tray of champagne. His hands were shaking violently as he went to place the crystal flute in front of Alexander. The glass wobbled, tipped and spilled freezing champagne directly onto Alexander's custom silk cuff. The young waiter froze in absolute terror. The entire VIP lounge instantly went dead silent. Everyone knew the executioner's legendary temper. Alexander stared blankly at the wet stain. His icy blue eyes turned instantly cold, and he slowly opened his mouth to completely destroy the boy's career. But before he could speak, Chloe gently placed her hand over his. She leaned in her dark hair cascading over his shoulder and whispered something softly into his ear. Alexander's terrifying expression instantly melted. He looked down at his beautiful, brilliant wife, a dark, incredibly fond smirk playing on his lips. He turned his gaze back to the terrified young waiter. "Accidents happen," Alexander said calmly, his voice smooth and remarkably forgiving. "Clean it up, please, and bring my wife another glass of your best champagne." The waiter scrambled away, practically weeping tears of relief. "You are getting incredibly soft in your old age, Mr. Thorne," Chloe teased lightly, sipping her water. Alexander leaned back against the leather booth, confidently draping his large arm around her shoulders and pulling her tightly against his side. "I am not soft, Mrs. Thorne. I simply know better than to argue with my boss." Chloe laughed, a bright, beautiful sound that rang out clearly over the dark club. She was no longer the desperate, terrified waitress who had whispered a fatal mistake. She was the absolute queen of the city, the brilliant woman who had flawlessly tamed the devil one whisper at a time.